Hello and welcome to the fourth and final of our Good Relations lectures. This one is on the topic of women and peace building now and into the future. In the previous lecture, we talked a little bit about the role of women in peace building in the run-up to the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement, going back from the early days. Much of the work that was done without a great deal of recognition. And there are many, many people, particularly women, whose names aren't really recorded in the history books and whose knowledge maybe was passed to a small number of people with the understanding that the work would be carried on. And in some cases, that has continued to happen. In other cases, some of that knowledge and information is getting lost, particularly as time moves on and more of those people are getting more elderly or no longer with us. So an awful lot of the work is unfinished. As we know, we are 22 to 23 years past the Good Friday Agreement, and there is still a need for peace building work and peacemaking work. And a lot of the work is continuing in the spirit of the work that was done before, particularly in women's centres, who do a great deal of cross-community work with young women, I suppose normalising engagement with other communities, and that includes newer communities that are moving to Northern Ireland for a first time, and work generally to integrate these communities into our existing two communities, and I suppose broaden the conversation about community relations as a whole. Now, work with young people still has to continue. However, an awful lot of youth work focuses heavily on young men because they focus primarily on those most at risk of offending, which is mainly, but not exclusively, young men. And then there is a great deal of focus on cross-community sports, which again tends to attract primarily, but not exclusively, young men. And this means that an awful lot of mainstream community relations work is not particularly inclusive of young women, or is not reaching out deliberately to young women. There's work done, like I said, within women's centres and in women's community work, but it is very much a small minority of the overall picture of community relations work in Northern Ireland. In the very first of our lectures, we talked about some of the work that WRDA has done in the past. And all of these lectures you can find on the same page as this one on our wrda.net website. So some of the aspects that we focused on was sort of, I suppose, high-level peace-building work and toolkits produced in order to show people how to carry that work out. However, another aspect of our work over the last number of years has been working directly with women in communities, speaking to them and learning from them the issues that are concerning them most and their main priorities. And that's what we're going to talk about in this lecture. The main themes that come up again and again in work with the women that we have worked with, me personally over 3 years, and WRDA over the past 5 or 6 years that we've been funded by the Community Relations Council. So we have approached our work in this way, that is to say, talking directly with the women affected, for a few different reasons. First of all, instead of coming into community groups with a lesson plan, you get a lot more engagement if you do it the other way around and allow the group to, I suppose, list their priorities and to adjust the remaining time you have with them according to what they're most concerned about. But also because that way we can be sure that when we speak about the issues that women on the ground are concerned about, we are speaking accurately, and that these women have told us that themselves, rather than have us put the words into their mouths. It also means it gives them more agency in what work we do after we have finished engagement directly with them. And an awful lot of them will say similarly that they've really not been asked their concerns directly before, unless they're engaging with women's centres. But many women, of course, don't have any women's centres locally, particularly rural women. And so sometimes they feel like they're not their issues and concerns aren't considered a priority overall in the priorities of government here in Stormont, in Westminster, or indeed in local councils, and that they rarely hear their issues being talked about as priority issues. And this has been particularly pronounced in the last year during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. So we're going to go through some of the themes, and there's a significant variance between the priorities of various groups. I wouldn't want to give the impression that everybody has the same priorities. Having said that, some issues come up a lot. Others are quite specific and quite local and refer to the area that the group are located in or that the person is living in. But there's a good deal of concern, like I said, that these issues aren't being spoken about with any degree of seriousness at the highest decision-making levels. They're sometimes reduced to women's issues or minority issues, or issues that ultimately come way down the list of priorities below other issues that are decided or deemed more important. And many of these mirror the issues that were outlined by the women who answered our 2018 online survey. We did a survey that we were going to use, and we did use, to shape the work that we did for the following 2 years. And an awful lot of the issues that came up in that are reflected in the conversations that we have face to face. So one of the most common themes is the issue of health. And this predates the pandemic, but also has taken on a particular slant in the last year because of the pandemic. When I say health, we're including physical health, such as, for example, concerns over rural isolation and how difficult it can be for people living in relatively remote rural areas, particularly living on their own in those areas without access to transport, to access healthcare. People have talked about long waiting lists to see doctors. They've talked about finally getting to see a doctor and then being told, this is a function of your age, of your gender, of your body type, something like that. And then, perhaps living with worries or having a very long wait before they get the diagnosis that they needed. There's also worries related to COVID. A good number of people are finding themselves isolated because of the circumstances that we're in now, and that perhaps they live alone, and they're afraid of COVID because of underlying conditions that they might have. They also feel like perhaps the people with underlying conditions who were told to isolate in the height of the pandemic were not given enough guidance. That came up a great deal as well about how and when they should be able to interact with other people at all. They talked about long waiting lists for certain treatments or certain surgeries, and that came up again and again, especially before the pandemic, but even more so in light of people having operations delayed and so on because of the pandemic. So also, when we speak about health, it includes mental health. And this is one of the things that has come up in, I think, just about every group I have spoken to over the last 2 years, which is many dozens of groups. There is a view that Northern Ireland has a really serious problem when it comes to mental health. It's reflected in our disproportionately high suicide rates, but it's also reflected in the disproportionately high number of people living with mental health issues, as compounded by the history of this place. People are concerned about intergenerational trauma as well. That is to say, trauma experienced and then, I suppose, passed on to younger generations of people who may not have experienced trauma themselves, but who have picked up some of the effects of it from parents, grandparents, communities as a whole. They were also very worried about a lack of really serious investment in mental health services. Quite a number of them are shocked to realise that Northern Ireland has less of an input into mental health services than, for example, England, given our history, given our notably higher rates of mental health issues. And they also feel like some of the, I suppose, advertising and outreach around this topic that says, reach out if you need help, can actually be not quite counterproductive, but certainly it can leave communities not sure what to do, because when a person reaches out for help, they should be able to access help immediately, but oftentimes they're left relying on medications from their GP and a long waiting list to have any counselling. So they would like to see counselling services stepped up. They would like to see people receive more immediate help when they do reach out for help, and to understand it as an emergency and not as something to be put on yet another waiting list for. So there's a feeling that there needs to be a prioritisation of mental health here, and even more so in the pandemic. There's also persistently, it comes up that people find themselves isolated and lonely, particularly older women, perhaps whose husbands may not be with them anymore, whose partners may not be with them anymore, or who maybe used to live in a very tight-knit community, but the nature of the community has changed and they don't know their neighbours the way they did before. And they feel isolated, they feel lonely. And this is, of course, massively heightened during the pandemic. And while many are extremely grateful for and wanted to point out how grateful they were to those organisations doing outreach during the pandemic, they talk about things like the amount of adjustment that some people have had to try and get used to talking over the phone or talking online when they're really more comfortable with, a face-to-face conversation, and how the discomfort with technology might actually mean that you're feeling more awkward and you are feeling relaxed when you do get these outreach calls and so on. But they talk about these things as ongoing issues that existed before the pandemic and will exist after as well. So there's a concern there about, I suppose behind that is also worries about the community fabric breaking down a little bit, or a lot, I suppose, in some cases, where people feel very isolated, even in very built up urban areas. Another theme that comes up a great deal is leadership, or perhaps better phrased as dissatisfaction with poor leadership or a lack of leadership, as how it's perceived. Across all communities, frustration is probably the best way to describe people's feeling about many of our elected politicians, and this is at all levels, particularly Stormont. And this, bear in mind, we did a great deal of this work while Stormont was collapsed, so the frustration was coming through partially because of that, but also with the Westminster government as well. An awful lot of the themes or the conversation comes back to the feeling that there's a lack of a real optimistic vision for the future, that they don't have in mind a bright future for this place that they're working towards. And that, yes, people understand that it's not always smooth sailing getting there, but it's the feeling that there's a lack of that vision to begin with. Some of the themes that have come up are things like paramilitarism hasn't gone away. We are 23 years past the Good Friday Agreement, and we still have so-called paramilitary organisations active in our communities, and some communities feel that very much as a clear and present reality in their lives. Some less so, but they're still acutely aware of it being out there. And they link that very often to drugs, and they link that also to mental health issues, saying that the presence of, I suppose, the easy access to illegal drugs in the community, including prescription medications that are being sold off prescription, can often exacerbate existing mental health issues. And the mental health issues themselves could be naturally occurring, or they could be connected also to the overall, I suppose, lack of leadership. What people are often saying is there aren't enough jobs, there isn't enough hope for the future, and young people are turning to drugs and to alcohol to self-medicate out of, or to entertain themselves. And that is linked very closely to exacerbating the mental health issues that made them reach out in the first place for those crutches, but also it's all linked with paramilitarism. So they really see these things as being deeply connected with the lack of moving forward. And they are sometimes quite frustrated with the lack of action from those in charge to do something about the ongoing existence of paramilitary organizations who they're often keen to stress don't represent in their mind the same thing as paramilitary organizations of the past might have represented. They see them as being effectively I suppose, illegal activities under the guise of paramilitarism. And there's a great deal of frustration about that, not just because we shouldn't still have them, but because they feel they have a corrosive effect on their communities. And there's also a fear about them as well, fear of speaking about them, and a fear of getting anything done. And they're looking to leadership for that, and they're not seeing what they want to see. Sometimes there's a feeling that we'll have to wait at least a generation to get past the trauma of the past so that we can collectively decide on a better future that's less divided. But there's a mixed degree of optimism because many people are seeing that those involved in paramilitary activity and so on, whose interest it is to keep things as they are actually young enough to have not been alive during the conflict itself. And so there's a mixed degrees of optimism about that. And there's sometimes a feeling that we didn't seize the moment when we could have. And so we are left replaying the same situation again and again. And like I said, it all depends on the individuals you're speaking to, but I'm just stressing that there is a mixed degree of feeling about this. Another theme that comes up a great deal is equality issues overall. Specifically, people are concerned about inequalities that are enduring in our society. And I'm breaking them down roughly as below, but they do overlap a good deal as well. So one of the themes that comes up a lot is gender inequality, a feeling that we are behind our neighbouring jurisdictions on these two islands, and we're falling further behind by refusing to really take some of these things seriously. These conversations are sometimes sparked by a recent incident in the news or a specific debate that has been going on, but the themes come up again and again. And what people are most frustrated by, I think, is the feeling that when you raise these issues, they are raised separately as women's issues, as opposed to part of the main political conversation that's going on. And this is what I was speaking about earlier when I said these issues aren't treated with any degree of seriousness, and that increases the level of frustration and disengagement. So, for example, a lot of people spoke of their frustration as to how issues around childcare and schooling have been dealt with in the aftermath of COVID-19. We know that COVID impacted women very severely in terms of needing to leave jobs or to take time off jobs in order to homeschool or to look after children. And that didn't deem a mention in the COVID, I suppose, recovery plan that was produced by Stormont. And that was it wasn't just frustrating because it lacked clear guidance. An awful lot of people perceived that as a deliberate slight on women and women's issues, rightly or wrongly. There's a feeling that there's society, and then there's a little section over in the corner that women are allowed to talk about their issues in, but it's not real politics, it's not grown-up politics. And that frustration was palpable in many of the conversations that we've had. Disability discrimination, which again links there because disabled women are particularly impacted by what went on in COVID. And there's a feeling that those people with issues that might be lifelong are being particularly targeted by welfare reform and by the outworkings of the new welfare system. People talked a lot about PIP and how it makes them feel like they have to constantly justify their existence. Particularly those people who themselves are on various disability benefits, but also the parents of children with disabilities. People feel like they are not trusted by government and by electorate not taken seriously, and that they're almost like an additional barrier. And then when you add in COVID-19 and the public discussion around that often focused on how it's something that is particularly problematic for people with underlying conditions, that also was perceived as I suppose, being left behind or being less of a priority or ultimately worth sacrificing. We also talked about hate crime overall, but particularly racist hate crime, with the information that racist motivated hate incidents are now significantly outnumber sectarian motivated hate incidents. And there were many people who said they live in very nice, inclusive communities, but that they know that they don't know the whole story. And that for particular visible minorities, most notably Muslims, and most notably Muslim women who might be visible because of their wearing of headdresses. And a lot of people felt that there's a great deal of racism targeted towards them that may not be always for want of a better word, headline news, but it will be constant, and it's something that makes people feel very uncomfortable in communities here. Not all communities and not all individuals, but many of them. And looking at the numbers of racist race-motivated hate crimes is shocking, but what's even more shocking is the reality that many of these people won't report because they won't feel like they're being taken seriously, or indeed they face other barriers around reporting, such as language barriers. And it's something that people felt we need to get a grasp on and talk about really seriously, and we need to do it sooner rather than later, because as time moves on, the minority will become larger and may be perceived as more of a threat by those who would target them, and that we need to make it clear where we as a community stand on this and not be tolerant of racist hate crime in any form. Economic inequalities are kind of the underpinning of all of this. We talked about economic inequalities as they intersect with these various other inequalities, particularly gender inequality and disability discrimination. There was very much a feeling that the direction of travel of the Westminster government was not in any way alleviating economic issues, in fact, was significantly worsening it. There was sometimes a view that this was by design rather than by accident. And gender and disability issues were exacerbated considerably by the outworkings of welfare reform, which came up again and again and again. People were horrified to realise that there was so much child poverty, and a conversation that came up a great deal around the free schools meals debate that went on throughout this year of the pandemic was the shock at the realisation that there were so many young people who were living in poverty or absolute poverty, you know, behind what appeared to be perfectly good front doors. And I think it was a shock for some people, and it's a reality for many others. And there's a feeling that economic inequalities are, instead of gradually getting better, are just being hidden better. And that's something that they felt really needs more serious consideration and a totally different approach from government. And last on this list is LGBTQ plus equality. That used to come up a good deal around the debate around equal marriage. Many people felt a lack of leadership from their politicians who perhaps they had voted for a long time, but they felt abandoned. Their perhaps themselves, their siblings, their children, their grandchildren who are LGBT. And a good number of people expressed anger at the reluctance to implement equal marriage. Now that equal marriage is legal in Northern Ireland and accessible, it still comes up occasionally, particularly some people who have loved ones who are struggling to access healthcare as transgender young people. So it does get mentioned in that context, less than it used to, but it's still an issue people are concerned about. And finally, talking about the future. So education was listed again and again and again as the best means we have to a better future. But it isn't just simply access to education, it's the quality of education. And I suppose, who else is in the room with you? A lot of people felt that integrated education was a good step, but that to really integrate, we need integrated communities as well. So not just are you going to the same schools as people from a different background, but you're also living together, playing together on the same streets and so on, playing the same sports, or at least accessing the same leisure centres. There's a feeling that integrated education will be such a positive step, and that's why it's so difficult to get your children into integrated education. Many people have tried and really, really struggled to be able to get their children into integrated education because there aren't enough places. Some perceive a deliberate choice by political actors who won't put the funding necessary into integrated education in order to keep things divided. But that's again going back to the struggles around leadership and the feelings people have that our leadership isn't always doing the best for us. There's also a concern about young people being very frustrated with the slow progress, and that many young people who can leave because perhaps they have a good education or they have good prospects will leave and maybe never come back. They will go to Great Britain for an education and not return, or they will, at the first opportunity, go to Australia, the United States, somewhere in Europe. And many people have spoken about their children going abroad to study and simply not coming back. There's also a feeling that some of the young people who stay might be at risk. And I don't mean necessarily at risk of offending or anything like that, but at risk of the lack of prospects and the lack of optimism about the future affecting their mental health and perhaps affecting their future prospects because of the impact on their mental health. So there is that worry about we're losing the best of our young people who could perhaps lead us to a brighter future, to better prospects elsewhere. And behind all of that sometimes is the fear of a loss of knowledge after previous generations of peacemakers get older. I mentioned this at the start. Part of our plans for next year were to start a new programme where peacemakers who had perhaps got a bit of experience would work together with younger people. That's not going to happen. WRDA is not going to be funded to do community relations work next year in the traditional sense. However, it's not the end of our peacebuilding work by any means. And we will be continuing to do this work. So watch this space for more work that we might be doing in future. But there is the fear that our young people aren't learning those skills and that they will need them because we are far from out of the woods, and we're constantly buffered from pillar to post by the news, by changes to the situation around Brexit and so on, that make people feel uncertain, and it contributes to that anxiety that may lead to people leaving, but also it contributes to the anxiety that we are losing important parts of our knowledge and that lessons haven't really been learned and we'll need to learn them again. Having said that, overall, there is a cautious sort of optimism. I say cautious because a lot of people feel like you don't want to be too optimistic because we have been let down before. But also there's an optimism because people have a great deal of faith in the communities that they live in the people who they saw step up during the worst of the pandemic, during the worst of the troubles. And they know that there's a great deal of, I suppose, reserves of strength, and there's vision among people here. And it's just a matter of getting those people into positions where they can be listened to and taken seriously. And they know that there's a great deal of good work going on in communities. So this is the reason for the cautious optimism. And on the balance of things, people do want to keep doing work like this because they have faith in the future of this place. So thank you at this point for listening. This is the fourth, like I said, of 4 lectures. There are 3 others to cover historical perspectives and so on. You can watch them all on our website, wrda.net. There is also one more upload coming to our website, which will be a recording of an event that we held in September of 2020 for Good Relations Week about women, peace and security in a post-COVID world. And it's approximately an hour long, more detailed perhaps in this one, with a number of different people speaking about their perspectives and experiences. So I want to thank you again for staying with us. And again, we won't be doing the community relations work as we had been doing for the past number of years for next year, but we will continue to do work to elevate women and peace building in Northern Ireland. Thanks.